Hi everyone and welcome. I'm Elizabeth Raley from CivicActions. As you know, California's Agile Development Prequalified vendor pool has opened up to invite more vendors. Our call today is about how CivicActions earned a spot on the pool during the first round. We value openness and transparency and hope that by sharing our lessons learned, that other great companies earn a spot as well. Some team members that worked on the bid are going to present today, and we'll start with Rob Reed, who's going to moderate this presentation. Hey, Rob.
Hello, everybody, and welcome. While Elizabeth is getting the presentation up, let me just say that we're not offering legal advice and we're not guaranteeing a result, but in the spirit of humbly sharing what worked for us, we're going to be as honest as we can about what we recommend and what we did. This may not work for every company. Everybody's situation is going to be a little different, and the next challenge could be different. But we're just trying to follow our motto of fierce openness and sharing what we did. Next slide, please. We've organized this webinar into 3 sections. We're going to talk about what we actually did for 35 minutes, what we recommend for 10 minutes, and then we're going to have 15 minutes of discussion and Q&A. At the bottom of your screen, you should find a Q&A tool which will allow you to chat questions to us. If we think there's something unclear, we'll interrupt this presentation. If not, we'll hold those questions until the end. It's important to remember that as specified by the rules, we put everything that we did in an open GitHub repo. The URL is here, so you can see much of what we did, including our interviews and our notes. It's also very important to understand that we started on day 1 with that repo and included all our notes as they evolved rather than doing it later. Next slide, please. So now we're going to talk about what we did, and in particular about the team composition. Then we'll talk about the process we used, the importance of user focus and user experience engineering, the very critical importance of DevOps or deployment, and the necessity to document everything. Process will be discussed by Elizabeth Raley, who's here on the call and acted as our Agile coach on this project. I'm moderating, and I was the product manager or product owner. Owen Barton is going to talk about DevOps, and Jen Harris is going to talk about the user experience and usability testing that we did. I'd like to use this slide to talk a little bit about challenge team composition, because the executive and leadership of any firm, when they're faced with a challenge, has to put together a team. And my recommendation is that you have approximately the same number of user-facing people that you have software engineers. Often people put too many software engineers and not enough user-facing people on a team. Also, we'll talk later on about why all of these roles are necessary. Next slide, please. Next slide. And let me hand it back over to Elizabeth to talk about the actual Agile process that we used during this challenge.
Thank you. So the challenge, of course, is to show your agility and your ability to follow the process. This was really difficult when you consider that you're condensing a lot of work into a very short timeline. Our method for success was to hunker down and follow our process to a T. We used our Scrum framework along with lean practices that made sense for a prototype. We did 6 two-day sprints, and during each sprint, we did all of our Scrum ceremonies, and we ensured that the product owner was just about as full-time as the development team. Rob was very engaged. So we would start a sprint with a planning meeting. We'd ask Rob, our product owner, what the priorities were for this sprint. We would estimate the cards together, and then at the end of the 2 days, we would demo the work, and Rob, our product owner, would then prioritize. What would come next is that it would just start all over. So we would have retrospectives as well after the demos, and because we were only focusing on 2 days of work at a time, we could actually do all of this in an hour. So by sprint 2, we would have the demo from sprint 1, we would have the retrospective from sprint 1, and then we would sprint plan for sprint 2, all of that in the time box of an hour. There was certainly stress around not getting everything done. At the end of a sprint, you know, people would want to push the meetings, you know, let us keep working, we need to finish some things, let's push the next meeting. But we really stuck to our process and ensured that the prioritization decisions were actually made by the product owner. What you're seeing here is our product backlog. This was incredibly robust, and it was the focal point in everything that we did. We used Waffle, which is a tool that integrates directly with GitHub. Of course, your normal backlog tool would work as well. Our product owner, along with our other team members who had input, were constantly in this backlog. So we'd learn something from a user interview or a demo or a technical issue, and the backlog was in constant motion, outside, of course, whatever we had locked in for the sprint. And again, it would have been easy not to update the backlog and just have the conversations since we were moving so quickly. But our product owner helped to ensure that everything that was being worked on was represented, and everything that was either prioritized or deprioritized was reflected right here. We were very disciplined, and ultimately that helped to keep our time boxes concise when it came to the demo and to the sprint planning. You know, like I said, we could do all of that within an hour, and we were using the backlog to keep it concise. We knew where to look. We knew what was being demoed. We knew what was going to be prioritized next based on this backlog. And then, of course, packaging up our documentation for the submission to the state, this backlog was up to date. It had everything in there. So the product backlog was our most visible and our most important artifact.
Thank you, Elizabeth. So let me just point out that I've used this process of very compressed sprint cycles on a number of government challenges, some of which are 2 weeks, some of which are 2 days, some of which are 4 hours. And it can create some emotional tension. It sometimes feels like you're rushing. It's often hard for people to accept such a tight time box. And sometimes it feels like you're inefficient because you're having meetings all the time instead of just coding. But there are enormous benefits to doing it this way. The most important is you get very rapid learning by having your first demo available for users to use. You have a so-called lean method where you're getting feedback immediately in the first sprint, and you can capitalize on those learnings very quickly and adjust each sprint to reflect what you're learning. Also, because you're always releasable, there's almost no chance that you're not going to be able to complete the assignment. It may be that you don't achieve everything that you desire, but you always have a working product from day one. Next slide, please. So now we're going to have Jen Harris talk in just one more slide about user focus, but let me point out that our CEO, Henry Poole, did something really important, which we recommend to all of you. I don't know how he did it, but he lined up volunteer foster parents and caseworkers, and we were ready to interview them during the first sprint. And so that work, which is not normally considered a part of software development, of finding real users, in this case, real foster parents and caseworkers, was critical to our approach to this. And we brought the same users into all of our sprint demos. At our GitHub repository, you will see even video recordings and audio recordings of some of our interviews with those people. And I would like to point out that we got permission, not from all of them. The people we didn't get permission from are not in our GitHub repository, to put that information there. And of course, we recommend you respect the privacy of your users as well. Next slide, please. And so now let me give it to Jen Harris, our UX engineer, to explain the various techniques we used.
Thank you, Rob. So yeah, as Rob mentioned, for this project and for pretty much all the projects that we work on, users are totally critical. So we followed a user-centered design process, and by doing this, by talking to users who were able to give us insight into the ins and outs of the foster care system in California, and to help us to understand the needs and pain points of both caseworkers and parents who are engaged with the system, We got a lot of clues and information about what features and user stories would be important to the users of this system that we were designing. And I just want to stress that without direct communication with these people who are very familiar with this system, we would have been designing in the dark. So this slide is showing the 6 techniques that we used to keep the focus on users throughout the design and development cycles. And in the next few slides, I'm going to talk briefly about each of these techniques and how we use them in this project. So next slide. Thank you. So when we started the project, we knew very little about the foster care system in California. Having found the real users to talk to us, we wrote open-ended interview questions and conducted our initial interviews to gather, as much information as we could. So it was very open-ended. It was kind of very conversational, and we engaged directly with these people to have them provide as much information as they thought we might need to design a system that would help them. So we interviewed some caseworkers and some foster parents and learned information about things like the typical hectic workday for a caseworker, the deeply emotional motivations and experiences of the foster parents, and the types of communications that are typical between these 2 user groups. Next slide. So using what we learned in these initial interviews, we built out simple user personas really quick, just documenting contextual information, goals, pains, and potential design implications for each user type. Next slide. For this project, we decided to also build an empathy map to better understand the parents who are engaging with the foster care system. So empathy mapping bridges the gap between the personas and the design concepts by helping us to consider how the people are thinking and feeling. It reveals things like the underlying why behind the user's actions, choices, and decisions, so we can proactively design for their real needs. It also kind of sticks with all the team members on the project. So rather than just a persona with a list of information or some other kind of report, the graphical look and way that the empathy map is structured actually really allows us to absorb the information. And it paves the way for maybe unexpected and innovative design concepts to be revealed. As the stakeholders, and the developers and designers on this project, we had a better understanding of the user situations that could that informed our design decisions and helped us to really empathize and understand how a small design change might make a big impact on the users. So the user personas and the empathy map drove the generation of user stories, the sort of keystone of Agile development. And a story map is a helpful shape for arranging these user stories. So at the top of the map, for those who aren't familiar with this technique, are the big stories. So the blue and orange cards there at the top. And these are things like communicate with caseworkers via an inbox. That was an example of one of ours. These big stories break down into other stories, otherwise known as user tasks, things like send a message or read a message. And those are the yellow cards that kind of go along the bottom, along the top under those orange and blue cards. A user task is what users do to reach their goals. So the work we did with the personas and the empathy maps helped us to understand these goals, which helped us to better understand what user tasks we might need to be designing for. And then below the user tasks in the white cards are additional details, things like indicate the priority or urgency of the message I'm sending. So we were able to prioritize these specific details using the story map and then bring these things into our product backlog for the developers and designers to work on. And this was a artifact that was a living document. So throughout the entire sprint cycle, several sprints, we continued to update this map, which helped us to keep our product backlog up to date. So basically, it's a way that we arrange the small things under the big things in a kind of grid form And this helps all of us, designers, developers, and product owner, to understand the really big story about the system. All right, next slide. Once we identified user stories and arranged them on our map, we were able to pinpoint our main design programs, and we held an informal design studio to generate sketches. For those who aren't familiar with this technique, it's a lean UX technique for collaborative design. So we involved engineers as well as designers in this process of making sketches, and then use these to develop wireframes. Next slide. So in here are some of the wireframes. We designed for both mobile and desktop based on the feedback we got from users. And once we had the wireframes actually in hand, we demoed these lo-fi prototypes with users to get early feedback and iterated on the designs. So this process was ongoing and concurrent with development throughout the project. And using a parallel process like this enabled us to conduct research, design, development simultaneously, which was super important given the short timeline. Next slide.
Thank you very much, Jen. And one of the things that CivicActions did really well is we explored new techniques that perhaps the team had not used before, and that included some UX techniques. So as I'm going to discuss later, one thing you want to do on these challenges is always leave your own team having learned something from the challenge. Now I'd like to hand it over to Owen Barton, the Director of Engineering at CivicActions, who's going to talk about DevOps. I have tremendous respect for people who understand DevOps because I'm personally not very good at it.
All right, thanks, Rob. Yeah, the DevOps approach I think was pretty key. You know, one of the things we find with these kind of challenges is it takes a lot of time for developers to get familiar with the context of what's being built, and it's very easy to lose sight of having a deployed product and how important that is. And I think really emphasizing the last step of deploying and making sure you're getting to there in the first sprint is really critical. You know, I'll describe the tools we used. I would say certainly having tools that your engineers are familiar with is really important. We used primarily Docker for both sandboxes and deployments. We were deploying to Amazon Web Services with Docker Machine, and then deploying into that Docker machine. We were, as you know, is pretty much standard for DevOps. You want to script everything. So we had all of our sandbox setup was automated, and then it was also the entire deployment was automated. So every time somebody wanted to trigger a new deployment, they could run a command with Slack that would tell Jenkins to start a new deployment. And in fact, anyone could initiate a deployment at any time. It did a complete end-to-end deployment, like a new AWS instance. It would bring up the application, run all the tests. If the test passed, then it would switch DNS with Cloudflare to the new deployment. And doing it from the ground up each time makes it very easy to iterate if you need to change your configuration of what your Docker compose file is running. You know, say you want to switch from MySQL to Postgres, or you want to do, it's not even a radical change. It unlocks a lot of flexibility. That means if something's broken, you can just repeat the deployment to fix it. You never have to log into a server. So yeah, that's the kind of the infrastructure from code idea. We had very early, we had a simple Hello World application running, you know, using the same system on the end of our first sprint. And then we used that same script to deploy for all of our demos and all of our kind of manual testing. I think having somebody who's focused on the DevOps is really important. It's very hard to do if you're also trying to do development. They just have different sets of skills and different modes of operation, I guess. So yeah, make sure you have a good balance in your team. If you could go to the next slide, please. So I just go briefly describe some of the open source technology. This is really critical. while there are obviously proprietary tools to do most of what we're building, we found really leaning on open source for almost everything we did is very helpful in terms of operating quickly and building and iterating as we go. And you can see, if you look in our repository, you'll see we have a lot of documentation on the tools. You can see our deploy script, our automated test script. Docker and Jenkins, I've already mentioned. So our application was built on Drupal, which is something our engineers are particularly familiar with. It runs on the LAMP stack. Again, very straightforward. It doesn't need to be, not every piece of your stack needs to be the latest, greatest, framework. But it could be a mixture of what people are familiar with, what's the right fit for the problem you're working on. With Drupal, we definitely needed to make sure we had some ability to demonstrate some custom development, as well as leveraging Drupal strengths in terms of being able to kind of rapidly configure some of the structures and output. On the front end, we use Mapbox, jQuery, data tables, all pretty popular JavaScript libraries. For testing, again, it depends what you're working with. For us, we found we used Selenium. Particularly, there's a tool called Selenium Interpreter, which runs a JSON-based Selenium script, which is a lot easier to kind of get started with than something that integrates with a full language. And it allowed us to run front-end tests in real browsers in Firefox and Chrome on both mobile and desktop views. So we got really good breadth of coverage right off the bat. And again, that's all integrated into Jenkins, so it runs each time we run a build. I think that's it.
Thank you very much, Owen. And let me point out that in the GitHub repository, you will also find a link to the functioning website, which is still up. I won't go so far as to say it is impressive, but let me say something a little more strongly than Owen did. Without some familiarity with the wide variety of available open source tools and the ability to use them quickly, we could not have achieved what we wanted to achieve. In the modern programming world, a big part of every developer's job is to stay partially familiar with what the open source world offers in terms of those possibilities. So in just 1 second, I'm going to hand it over to Steve Curtis, who was responsible for getting all of the documentation and everything necessary to make a proper legal and successful submission to the state done. Those of you who may be applying, this may be a good time to submit questions if you have for Steve. Some of that we considered part of our Agile process, and we put those tasks in our backlog, but of course it's a little outside of that. Let me remind you that you can type things into the chat window and we will see them, or you can use the Q&A tool to answer questions if you have any questions for Steve or the rest of us. So Steve, please go ahead.
All right. Document everything, exclamation point. Rob's title, which I firmly stand behind here. Because as a project manager or delivery manager, I perhaps have a certain genetic predisposition toward documentation. Not for no reason. It helps keep the team all on the same page. It helps me have a constant and running sense of how the project is progressing, and it helps me share that progress back to the stakeholder. But in this case, hold on for just 1 second. Kids are home for President's Day week. Sorry about that interruption. But in this case, documentation serves even perhaps more of an important role, because in terms of the way these submissions are evaluated, it was our assumption that the sanctity of the product itself was perhaps less important than it might otherwise be. Certainly it had to had to work well. It had to adhere to certain standards and guidelines. Above everything else, it had to reflect user input. But we operated with the assumption that one of the major parts of our evaluation was going to be how our team enacted its agile processes. Which means what do we do? It means to what extent were those processes borne forth by the entire team, or to what extent were they championed by just a couple of agilistas off in the corner? And then how was all of that communicated back to the evaluators, which is where the importance of the documentation comes back. The documentation was our way of representing the way that we enacted agile processes back to the evaluation team. So just as we feel that in a good cross-functional team, agile practice itself is distributed throughout the team, we made a real move to have the entire team involved in the documentation itself. I, as the delivery manager, and Rob, as the product owner, certainly had an eye on organizing and formatting some of that and making sure that it was all compliant. But the documentation was not just something that we used to bundle up and ship off for evaluation. It was really an organizing principle for how the team communicated its work to one another. And again, all this is visible in the GitHub repository. Might not be neatly or impressively organized, but it's comprehensive and it's clear, which were the things that we were really trying to stress. So everything, Scrum notes, interview notes, screenshots of the storyboards and the Trello boards, all sorts of material was there for reference by the entire team, and it was the nexus by which the team tracked their progress on a daily basis. And as I noted, there was a certain amount of going through the nuts and bolts, making sure that I's were dotted and T's were crossed, that Rob and I did. But for the most part, this was really this was a very comprehensive group activity. So next slide, please.
And Steve, let me just interrupt. There's a question from Marquis Cabrera, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He asked, how did you go about documenting the playbook, which I think you're going to talk about on this next slide.
Yeah.
Could you make sure you address how we documented our conformity to the playbook?
So the playbook has certainly become the kind of archetypical document by which government agencies seek to enact agile practice, and it's become a real guiding light for CivicActions practice. We reflect on this as we undertake our own projects, and we took particular care to make sure that we were not only comprehensively cognizant and mindful of the plays, and as you may be familiar, each play has a whole checklist that accompanies it to items which you can ask yourself to determine whether your team is actually practicing these plays the way they might be intended. And our GitHub repository broke down these 13 plays and their attendant checklists on a one-by-one basis, where in each case we said, this is where you can look to see that our team did this. These are the ways that we did this. This is the person whom we held responsible for that. In some cases, we said this didn't apply to our process or project, but our documentation of the playbook was very comprehensive, and certainly one of the major focuses of my attention throughout the project.
And let me interrupt and point out that Owen has very kindly posted in the chat window a link to our checklist, which we used, and you guys are welcome to copy and reuse, where I think it's a link, I don't know if it's a link to the empty checklist or to the checklist where we documented exactly what we did on this challenge, but you guys can all see it. Thank you. Yeah, back to you, Steve.
There's both of them there, actually.
Okay, so next slide. Thank you. So certainly, and this was brought up in passing before, but one of the key elements of our Agile practice is the retrospective. This is where the team gathers at the end of a sprint, looks at the work that we've done, looks at how we might improve for the sprint to come. And as far as we understand Agile practice, it's one of really the primary ways to demonstrate that we're being Agile, to demonstrate that we're asking ourselves tough questions about what's working and what's not throughout our work, and adapting to new information that's coming in from users, new information that's coming in from the team. Rob, I had never seen this before this presentation, but Rob coined or brought to light this rose, bud, and thorn analogy, which is quite fitting. Roses are those things which are just beautifully formed, and we say, wow, that really worked perfectly in this sprint. Nice job, team. Thorns are the things that pricked us and tore at our flesh and made our work less perfect than we might have liked it to be. And buds are those things which are not yet fully formed, but which we recognize we really want to tend to and nourish and bring forth. So the buds are really what retrospectives are focused on. Hypotheses for how we might change our practice in the next sprint. Noting and then recording and then striving to act upon the feedback from these retrospectives were, in my opinion, really the crux of our Agile practice. And documenting this carefully was a big point. Certainly, if the team doesn't feel that it can be fully open and transparent with one another, then the retrospective doesn't work as effectively as it otherwise might. So encouraging real honesty from everybody and real frank assessment of how the work is going is essential to the retrospective. And I believe that's back to you, Rob. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. We've been able to stay on schedule. Thank you, everybody. So that means we should have time for questions. I would like to remind everybody that you can put something in the chat window, or even better, use the Q&A tool to ask us a question. We unfortunately cannot see your faces, so the questions you ask us will be the only way for us to understand what to talk about. Now I'm going to talk about what we recommend, and I'd like to remind you that we submit this humbly, and we're not making any promises that this will be successful for you. But one of the things I love about CivicActions is their dedication to fierce openness. And so we are just showing you what we did. You can take it or leave it and take those parts that apply to your organization and those that may not apply to your organization. Next slide, please. So one thing that's really important to understand and expect is ambiguity. In any government challenge, there will be ambiguity. Sometimes there will even be things that are not completely consistent in what they're asking for. A lot of times there's a Q&A session with the government. In this case, this will be the state of California, but it could be the federal government. And you get some of those questions answered, but rarely all of them are clearly answered. And your job, just like when you're taking the SAT or something, is to do the best job you can with the limited information that you have. And that's where perhaps the assignment of a role of a product owner is valuable, because in the end, Agile is a method of communication that allows a team to reach consensus, but one person may have to make a decision about what the government really wants. Next slide, please. So the biggest thing I would like to suggest is to try to make what you're doing real. And that's a very interesting guidepost, right? Because any challenge the government gives you is going to be contrived, in the sense that you don't really have enough time to produce functioning software. You don't really have the security clearances and the other things that you need to be successful. So it has to be in a little toy box area. But it's far better to try to make something real in this limited space of time, to go outside the box and to act as if you are building something real. So the starting point for that is to talk to real customers. I use the word customer to mean end user, not your not the state of California, right? Whoever is going to use the software. And you have to find them by hook or by crook. If you can't find the real person, you know, I suppose if you're building something for inmates, it might be hard to find that. You know, simulate it with people on your own team, but it's far better to get people who are not on your own team to do that. Try to build real software. As Owen discussed, make real deployments. Our software is still available. It's still live. It could potentially be used. And really be open and collaborative. So try to think of it not as an exercise, but as a tiny project that you are going to holistically treat as a complete project. Next slide, please. So what was the real story when we did this? What really happened? Well, once upon a time, prospective vendors were asked to build a tiny case management system and communication system. But when we spoke to real parents and caseworkers, they told us what they needed was not what the government was asking us to do for the exercise. What they told us they really needed was a way to arrange geographic pickup with a map using public transportation, because most of the end users here, the cohort, the biological parents, and sometimes the foster parents, don't have cars. In general, they do have cell phones. And so there's a pressing need to arrange visitation geographically. That was not directly part of this challenge, but we tackled it anyway. Also, we learned something very important by talking to people, that the state of California has no official way to notify people of the change of status of children. And this causes immense problems because biological and foster parents are always calling up the caseworker saying, has the status changed yet? Am I allowed to do this yet? Am I allowed to do that yet? And they always have to call the court, and it impedes the whole flow. Now, as a software company, we cannot change the court system of the state of California, but we did note this as information to give to California. Next slide, please. So did we really do anything about that? A little. Well, I would say we addressed 20% of it because we built a map with geolocated data that could potentially allow people to do visitation, which I think went beyond what the state of California was asking. And the learning is real. Next slide, please. So as part of sharing the real learning, in addition to what we gave the state, which they may or may not have looked at our GitHub repository and seen all our user interviews, we also wrote up several blog posts. And I'm happy to say the first one listed here was co-written with one of our front-end developers, Heather Rodriguez, and also a woman who is a foster parent. And so we co-wrote that and tried to describe what we learned here. It's also the case that the CEO of CivicActions, Henry Poole, and I have written another article about how to do challenges in general, of which the California one is one. And of course, in this webinar, we're also trying to share that. Next slide, please. So let me hand it back to Owen now to talk about this aspect of what we recommend.
Great. So, yeah, and I think this is one of the hardest parts of working on this kind of type of challenge, is that everyone's drive is to deliver something really impressive, right? You want to deliver something that's shiny and has lots of functionality and has great design and is beautifully architected and has nice clean code with full of comments and everything's tested. And, you know, that's not going to be possible in the time you've got. And you probably could get a bit further and deliver something a bit more impressive, but that would be at the sacrifice of the breadth of what you look at, what you deliver in your proposal. And I think it's really important to show that your team is not only capable of delivering a functioning application, but is capable of operating in the kind of enterprise environment where all of these little pieces need to have some attention paid to them. And so I would say, you know, be prepared to sacrifice some of the impressiveness and the technical quality even, or the design quality of what you're delivering, to be able to make sure you have time to really demonstrate, you know, a broad understanding of what it takes to deliver software in the environment, you know, that the Playbook and the state is going to be looking for. So that includes, you know, not only the kind of the full UX design and all of the agile components and doing lots of iterations, but also, and not only the DevOps stuff, really documenting all of your DevOps pieces, but also like making sure you set aside time to do and document some cross-browser, cross-device, testing and review, security review, doing some basic accessibility testing, reviewing your software licenses. What are the licenses for all the libraries you're using? Making sure that those are documented in your repository. That's going to be an important thing for the state, and it's one of the items in the USGS playbook, and would be very, very easy to forget. And putting attention into the quality of your deploy. Just putting something up on some server that you have internally, that's fine. But I think if you can go a bit further and really model it as infrastructure as code, you can have a CDN, you can have some SSL set up, you have some type of monitoring or alerts, even if it's pretty rough around the edges. And ours was certainly rough around the edges, but it had something that was going to tell us if the site went down or if it got really slow. Just being able to show that you're paying attention to all of these different pieces, I think is really key. And if you're really looking at it from the point of view of the USGS playbook, you will be looking at all of these different pieces and kind of setting up that context that you need to let go of the the impressiveness of your app is going to help your team, and just come to it with the perspective that you're delivering something a little bit different from just an working application. You're delivering a working team. So yeah, I think that was really the point on that, and it's a hard thing to do. It requires giving up a little bit of what your natural inclination might be.
Okay, thank you, Owen. Next slide, please. So now let me talk a little bit to the executive of a firm that's participating in a government challenge, who perhaps has the power and responsibility to put together a team. It may be that you're busy with other things. You don't have a team just lying around to perform the challenge. You have to form it out of people who are very busy. So this is actually kind of a critical part of your success. As Kent Beck taught me a long time ago, he believes the number of developers should be approximately equal to the number of customer-facing people. And the customer-facing people are the user experience people, the QA people, the writers, the documentation people, and the product owner. It's very easy to get out of balance in that respect. As Owen was discussing, it's very important to have deployment expertise. That could be shared, of course, with a software engineer. It could be both a developer and a deployment person. Owen acted as our technical architect and our deployment person, but you have to have the skill. It doesn't have to be one person devoted to that, but you have to have the role. I think in a modern world, if you don't know exactly what the challenge is going to be, you should have a front-end JavaScript expert available. There are probably exceptions. I'm sure there are going to be challenges that are only about back-end database programming or algorithms or something like that. But in general, these challenges allow you to exploit browser-based capability to such an extent that you always want to have a front-end Java expert at least available, if not a full team member. I recommend front-loading design. I think design is very important, but I believe engineers should be involved in that. I personally, my experience has been when you get software engineers in the room or in the virtual experience, whichever it is, with the customer or the end user, magic just happens. Like you discover and do better things when you get those people talking to each other. Finally, in these government challenges, the leader, whether it's the Agile coach or the product manager, I don't know, or the CEO of the company, needs to manage customer communications as well as a team. That is, someone has to set up the interviews with the users. And it probably isn't going to be the software engineers. Maybe you can make that happen by putting that out there. Next slide, please. So I recommend that the coach get the whole team at the outset to agree that they're going to do these things. As Elizabeth discussed, maintain formal sprint discipline, find real users, always be demoable from the first sprint, constantly refine the backlog, which can be a little bit of a challenge because you're going to be moving very quickly. My personal style, if I may speak informally, is to be a time Nazi. I believe you should be very strict on time, but compromising on everything else. If you have a demo planned at the end of the sprint, you're going to have the demo and you're going to have users there, even if you have to say, we didn't get anything done. You're going to have a demo. Next slide, please. Remember, applaud often. Many people in your organization may not get applauded enough. Sometimes software engineers don't get to see the face of a user light up when they have made a good feature. Strive for real, if limited, utility in the limited space of time that you have. Part of what you're producing is the learnings that it produces by the end. So try to document those, whether it is only to the state of California or if you choose to share it with other members of this industry. The challenge should leave your team stronger than when it started in some way. You should think, even if we fail in this challenge, we are going to up our game in terms of our agile discipline, our user experience capability, our deployment capability, or perhaps even our management and leadership capability. Every team should learn something through this experience. And finally, it's my opinion that the team that cooperates the most competes the best. Next slide, please. Above all, it's important to remember we have Scrum ceremony in support of the Agile Manifesto, which is all about communication with the user. Above all, focus on the user. Everything else is just a means to an end of focusing on the user. Next slide, please. And so now we are done. Elizabeth, you can come back and let us see your face. And we have not received any further questions. We're happy to receive questions either through the Q&A tool or through the chat tool. We'll sit here for a few minutes to see if anyone can think of any questions or if they've been holding questions. So I'll just give you some time to think of that. And of course, you can address a question to anyone on our team.
And one thing I was going to bring up regarding the tracking of the USGS playbook, and I think a link was shared that people can look at. But I really liked how we did it, where we were having to document every day anyway. We were kind of keeping a diary, and we had the playbook really accessible. So when we were documenting what we had done that day, we would put USDS number 3, next to something if we had done the third play, which is make it simple and intuitive. It was a really nice way that I could go through and be like, oh yeah, look, we got all 13 plays by day 12 or whatever. Or, maybe there was a point where I was like, we haven't, been able to meet one of the plays, like, let's make sure that we're focusing on that this sprint. So it's something that's kind of cool, and, you can practice in your normal project work anyway. If anyone's writing a question, do you mind just putting in the chat that you're, oh, we have one. We have one in the chat, actually. So Marquise says, can you talk about the time box a bit more? I can speak on that. So the time box was really important in absolutely everything that we did. So we planned up front that we were going to do our sprints in 2 days. And we stuck to that. And like I had mentioned, we would get to the end of the day and we wouldn't be done. Like there would still be tickets in our sprint backlog that weren't complete. And there was the desire to just keep working, like we need to finish. And so we really were sticking to the time box. We said, no, we're going to stop, at 2 o'clock today, we're going to do our demo. We're going to demo what we have completed. We're going to retrospect, which, doesn't take that long when you're only retrospecting on 2 days worth of work, and then we're going to plan. And it's possible that what you all have been working on will get prioritized in the next 2 days, but it's very likely we're actually going to cut some of that out and move on to the next thing. So we would time box the sprints, we would time box our meetings, and we would just like stick to it. And it was very, very uncomfortable, but we did it. And I think that that is actually what got us to the end and having something that we could turn in. It wasn't completely done, but we had hit all of the points. We'd hit all the things that we needed to. I believe there's a question in the Q&A too. Okay, so someone anonymous said, has CivicActions been awarded any contracts from the vendor pool? So we have not. We've submitted 2, I think, maybe 3. One of them we're in the middle of right now. They haven't announced a winner yet, but we have not been awarded a contract yet. All right, another question.
Yes, let me direct this question to Owen. Marquis says, with respect to working code, you had code available day 1 to demo. Can you talk about what was being demoed?
Yeah, so again, you could have a look at the, if you look in the call notes directory, that has details of what was done. So we had 2-day sprints. So it was actually day 2 where we had our first demo, and that we didn't have working code yet. What we did have is we have the user stories. So essentially digested interviews, and then we had kind of the like hello world deployment. So basically an empty, you know, it was a working code, but it was an empty application. There wasn't anything specific to the use case. And then I think on sprint 2 we had yeah, I think sprint 2 we were aiming to have a kind of a working code to demo, and we didn't, but we demoed anyway. And I think what we had is what we were hoping is we could deploy this, you know, application and show it, you know, have users actually use this application. We weren't there yet, so I think what we did is we did essentially a screen share demo from the April's sandbox April was working on developers. So she kind of showed it, but we, you know, so we kind of demoed each of the pieces, you know, even though our goal was to have them connected by the end of the sprint. Yeah, and also, yeah, additional UX wireframes and so on.
Okay, so we can speak more about that, but we're also happy to take other questions if any of the other viewers, whom we really appreciate, have any questions for us. Nothing quite like dead air.
Sure, everyone's thinking.
Is this because our presentation is so awesome and everything's crystal clear that no one has any questions?
All right, well, let's wrap. Thank you, everyone, for participating and the questions that did come in. If you want to reach out to us, you can find us on Twitter.
We have a question. Wait. Woo! Okay, good job.
Put the pressure on.
Hand, Elizabeth. Elizabeth, go ahead, please.
All right, so the question is, were you previously on CMAS or did you have to get on that before applying? We had to get, Aaron, do you know the answer? I believe we had to get on CMAS before applying. Rowan, do you know?
I believe we got on CMAS following our acceptance in the pool.
Yeah, so we had an existing GSA schedule, and then after we were accepted in the pool, we submitted our CMAS paperwork, which included, writing up all of the different roles and rates and evidence for all of those.
Mm-hmm. Was everyone co-located during the build process? We're a completely remote team, so we did all of this work remotely. And the tools that we used, Google Hangouts for our meetings, Slack for our internal communication, Google Drive for our documentation, Waffle for our product backlog, and some other tools that Jen had mentioned just for UX, and of course GitHub. So we did it all remote, and it worked quite well.
There have been other challenges. We participated in the DHS Flash Flexible. Oh, that acronym eludes me now. But that one actually involved an on-site challenge, and for that one we gathered the team. That was an 8-hour challenge, so hyper compressed, but all of the same principles applied. And it was definitely interesting to track how our practice changed with the everybody elbow to elbow.
Let me point out that in every challenge which I have done, we focus on maintaining strict discipline. Some aspects of each challenge is different. The team composition is going to be different, the other things you have to do, but the discipline of the process remains the same. Jen Harris pointed out, maybe Jen, you could speak to some of the tools we used for communicating about user interface stuff.
Sure. Yeah. So for the story mapping, we use Stories on Board, which is I believe it's free still, tool. It's just storiesonboard.com, I think. And that's a story mapping tool that's super easy to use and is easy to collaborate on, because different people can be adding cards and moving things around, and it's simultaneously updated, kind of like Trello. And we also use MyBalsamic. Thanks for the link there, Owen. Yeah, MyBalsamic, which is a wireframing, online wireframing tool. So people can make comments, and different people can edit them if they have access. So
and I had never used those tools before that challenge, and it was effective for even a schlub like me to make comments and illustrations to send back to the UX designer about, things like, well, our software guys can't build it that way, so you're going to have to change something, and do that kind of important communication.
right.
So, I'm sure those tools are evolving, but if you're a remote team, you kind of have to practice doing that, and challenges are a good opportunity to use a new tool that you may not have used before.
And we're at the end. I wanted to also invite people, if you're in Sacramento, we're doing an Agile Meetup next week in Sacramento. So Thursday, March 2nd at the Urban Hive in Sacramento at 7 p.m. It would be great to continue the conversation. You can also find us on Twitter if any other questions come up. Would love to hear more, and we're going to share the presentation, and this video has been recorded. And I see Marquis asked a question about the open data that we used, challenges that existed. So I think we would love to respond to that, and why don't we connect with you on Twitter, and we can go from there, and we'll respect the time box and stop here. Thank you everyone for participating. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Great.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.